One of the most dangerous trends in American society today is gun control. Join us in this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle as we examine why the natural God given right to keep and bear arms is a critically important key to a free society. I am Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for libertarianism in the context of the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel, longtime libertarian friend, stretching all the way back to what, Richard, 1987 or so?
I think that was 1887. You're very well preserved, very well preserved.
Thank you
No,
very
but
much.
it is, you're right. It goes back to actually more likely 1984, because that's when I moved to Dallas, to the University of Dallas, 1984, the
That's
autumn
right.
of 1984.
That's right, because I moved to Dallas in 83. It was 87 when I moved to the Foundation for Economic Education. So it was during that period of time where, well, let's digress here for a moment. I had been taking a tutorial there at the University of Dallas. I was practicing law at the time. And the tutorial was with the head of the economics department there, a man named Sam Bostaff, who I had hired to tutor me in Austrian economics. And so he started back with basics, a chapter by chapter analysis of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, then David Ricardo's Principles, some of the classical economists, up through Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School of Economic Thought, a little bit of Eugen von Bombewerk. And then when we got to Ludwig von Mises, Richard comes into the department, and Sam turns me over and my tutorial over to Richard, who conducts a chapter by chapter analysis of Mises's Human Action.
It's true. That's how Jacob and I met. Now, of course, he was already a mature adult lawyer. I was a child prodigy of 5 years old. So, I try to respect my elders. I was so young, but that is how we met. Now, I'm going to take, since you started this, I'm going to tell the story to the viewers and listeners. And that is that at first I was reluctant to take Jacob on for this tutorial. I, of course, had read Mises's Human Action more than once, but I was new in the department at the University of Dallas. I had courses new to teach, lesson plans, preparation, notes. But then he offered me an honorarium for the tutorial. And he gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I started doing this and trying to be conscientious. I would prepare notes, for our little tutorials, what to go over. But when we'd sit down, often the conversations would soon go into a different direction. What's your view on this freedom issue? What do you think the libertarian stance is on here? And so as time went on, I realized I had to do less preparation and more just exchanging views. We did get through Human Action eventually. Now, on top of that, when the sessions were over, we met about once a week. Jacob very kindly would then offer to take me to lunch. So then this went on for a while, and then he drops this bomb on me that he's leaving Dallas. He's taking this job as the program director at the Foundation for Economic Education, which was then housed at a beautiful old mansion building in Westchester County in Irvington, New York. And I was traumatized. I almost went into a severe clinical depression. No work, good pay, and a free lunch, and it was going away. Oh no! but that's actually how Jacob and I met, and he was at FEE for a few years, and then had decided that he had a vision, an idea of another organization. Also espousing obviously a consistent classical liberal libertarian view, and therefore he decided to found the Future Freedom Foundation. He very kindly asked me to come on board as the vice president for academic affairs at that time, which is a role I happily played for about almost 15 years, Jacob, until I was given the honor of being invited to become the president of the for the Foundation for Economic Education. And I was FEE president for 5 years. And then I left that for a variety of reasons and ended up going back into academic teaching. And we sort of clicked again. So I'm back here with my old crony, offering these weekly insights on Libertarian Angle.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that after I went to FEE, you went to Hillsdale College and
Yes.
became the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics there. I think it's also worth pointing out that where we would go to lunch after our sessions, and that was a fantastic Mexican restaurant there in Irving, Texas. So we would, yeah, it was a great time. And so those of you that are new to the Libertarian Angle, I would invite you to come to our website at fff.org and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you get notices of these videos as well as other videos that we do. All right, Richard, I thought we would address one of the burning issues of our time, and that, of course, is gun control. Libertarians, of course, are ardently pro-gun rights. I happen to believe that the Second Amendment should have been put first, that I consider it much more important than the First Amendment, because without the right to keep and bear arms, the First Amendment's worthless. I mean, if governments know that people cannot resist tyranny, they'll just smash them. They'll put them in jail for criticizing the government and so forth. But when governments know that people are armed and can defend themselves against tyranny, they become much more respectful of people's natural God-given rights like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so forth. I mean, the right to keep and bear arms is really the key, or maybe a critically important key, to a free society. And it's important to keep in mind that right does not stem from the Second Amendment any more than any of the other rights stems from the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. People's rights don't come from the Constitution. They don't come from the Bill of Rights. If you see the wording, if you examine the wording carefully, like in the First Amendment, it doesn't give people the right of free speech. It says that Congress, and indirectly the entire federal government, is prohibited from infringing on free speech. So the framers were very careful to phrase these things to show that people's rights are inherent to them. They're natural, they're God-given. Even if there had been no federal government, even if there had been no Second Amendment, people still have the right to keep and bear arms. What they wanted to do with the Bill of Rights is just make certain that U.S. officials got the message, that the Constitution had called into existence a government with very few limited enumerated powers. And that's how it got sold to the American people, who were very leery. They were afraid that the government would turn into a tyrannical machine. And so they said, well, okay, we'll accept the deal on that premise, but after the Constitution is enacted, we want to make it clear that federal officials are restricted, expressly restricted, from taking away our rights. And that one of those, of course, was the Second Amendment. Now, there's people who believe that the right to keep and bear arms has something to do with deer hunting. And so they say, well, people shouldn't own assault rifles because you don't hunt with an assault rifle. Well, some people might, but that's not the point. The point is that under the principles of private ownership of property, you have a right to own whatever you want to own. Any gun you want, handgun or whatever, that's one of the fundamental rights that we talk about when we talk about natural God-given rights, the right of private ownership of property. Now, what's the idea behind this? Well, one is the right to protect yourself from criminals, murderers, rapists, thieves, burglars, come into your home. That it's this sense that you have a right to defend your life and the life of your family. It's self-defense. And so these people that want to take away guns, their assumption is that the murderers are going to comply with the gun control law, which is ridiculous. If a murderer doesn't give a hoot about a murder law and possibly get a life sentence without parole or even the death penalty, he's not going to give a hoot that he's convicted of possessing a gun without official permission. So all you do with gun control is disarm the peaceful, law-abiding people. You prevent them from defending themselves. But ultimately, the real purpose of the Second Amendment was to ensure that people had a right to resist the tyranny of their own government. That you disarm people, and if people permit themselves to get disarmed and give up all their guns to the government, I guarantee you they will make that mistake only once. That will be the only time they ever make that mistake, because the government will never let them have their guns back again in order to make the mistake a second time. That once you make the mistake and then tyranny takes over and government starts rounding people up and making it a criminal offense to oppose the government, or government officials not standing for election, sort of like what the U.S. government put into existence in Chile under Pinochet. You get that kind of system, and all of a sudden a disarmed citizen becomes very compliant, very obedient, because to resist is certain death. At least with the right to keep and bear arms, would-be tyrants think twice, because they know that people are so well armed that it's like, trying to swallow a porcupine if they go after them. So that's the basic overall framework of the right to keep and bear arms. Richard, what do you think?
Well, you laid it out very nicely. So what I'm going to say is going to be basically a complement or a slight enhancement of it. Following sort of what you say, I consider that the right to bear arms is derived from two scenarios. One, which you were just saying, is the right of personal self-defense. We live in a world in which there are sometimes bad people who would do you physical harm, steal that which is commonly and almost anyone would understand is your honest personal property. And often these people have the ability to threaten your life. They have physical strength. They have armaments or weapons of their own. The police are not always there, and they cannot always be there. So if an individual does not have the means of protecting himself and his family from an aggressive and life-threatening intruder into their own home, then what is their recourse? Now, I imagine that many opponents of gun ownership, particularly those on the left, would say, well, prayer and fasting. But that runs against their idea of separation of church and state in this in society. So the fact is that the individual must have the ability to protect himself from the private violence of others. Now, it may not be politically correct to say these things anymore, but on average and in general, physically, men are stronger than women, larger than women, and certainly two or more men can easily subdue an unarmed woman. There is nothing that serves as a more profound equalizer in those kind of situations than a woman having the ability to have a handgun in her purse to protect herself from accostation, theft, or physical violation, either rape or even the threatening of her own life. What parent would not like to have the means of self-protection in their own home when an aggressor, an intruder enters it, and their own family members, their own children are threatened? So at one level, in terms of the everyday life in a society such as our own, the importance of gun ownership is the protection against private aggressors. But in the bigger picture, the historical context, which you were also alluding to, the importance of the right to bear arms, ownership and bearing arms, is the protection as an extreme final measure to secure and protect yourself against the aggressions of your own government, of any government. As the events were building up to the American Revolution, the famous patriot, Patrick Henry, made the address one time of saying, when is a better time than now to stand up against British tyranny? When they will have disarmed us, or when we are an armed citizenry? James Madison, after the American Revolution, commented that governments are afraid of an armed citizenry because the citizens may be able to protect themselves against governmental despotism. A free government should not be fearful of their own citizens being armed against tyranny. Let me sort of do some other examples of this. It was the great tragedy that in the Second World War, millions of people, innocent men, women, and children, were killed by the Nazis, among which were 6 million Jews. Now, most of us have seen those documentary films or stories in the history books of how these multitudes of unarmed and innocent men, women, and children of Jewish background were just lined up before mass graves and shot, or walked into the gas chambers. And we're amazed by the passivity of this. But was it in something inherent in the people or the circumstance? No. It was the fact that they were unarmed. In 1943, the Nazis decided to clear out the remaining approximately 70,000 Jews in the Warsaw Jewish ghetto. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, expected that this would be a 3-day operation and they would all be passively herded on to the cattle cars and sent to the death camps, like all the others who had already been taken out of the Warsaw ghetto. But the Jews in the ghetto had been able to clandestinely acquire through underground means a small cache of weapons from the Polish underground outside in the countryside of the city. Not many rifles, not many pistols, limited amount of ammunition, but they also had kerosene and other forms of fuel to make Molotov cocktails out of. When the German forces started to enter the ghetto, they found armed and violent resistance. So rather than a 3-day affair to clean out the ghetto of the Jewish vermin, that small group of armed Jews in the ghetto held off the German army for 4 weeks. A handful of people with limited armaments. Now, the end, obviously, we know historically was inevitable. The rebellion in the ghetto was crushed. Those who were not killed in the violence were sent to the camps, and far too many, if not the vast majority of them, ended in that tragic fate of being killed anyway. But imagine that if there had been wide and pervasive gun ownership all through Europe, and that the Germans could not know which house, what apartment building, what farm had people who were armed and ready to defend themselves. Now, the left often says, but why do people need these private arms? So would you consider it wrong that the Allied powers during the Second World War, among their attempts to undermine Nazi control of the European continent, supplied arms and ammunition to civilians who were in the French underground to oppose Nazi occupation? Why, shouldn't you just rely upon the Nazi policeman being your friend? Now, that was the case of an aggressor. But what if the government, your own government, is doing that? We have been seeing for 8 years now this terrible tragedy in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Why did this rebellion start? Because Assad is a tyrant, as his father was before him. And the people revolted. Where did these armaments come from? Mostly the outside. Have they had a right to try to defend their freedom? Now, it looks like Assad, because of Russian support, will reestablish all of his power at the end of the day. But the matter of the principle, did the people of Syria have a right to try to overthrow what they viewed as a brutal and callous dictatorship under which they had to live? If you say yes, then you're saying that there are circumstances in which a population has a right to be armed to defend itself against the abuses and crimes of its own political authority. Now, we live in a country in which we know that there are abuses by the police, a bending of the rules in courts of law. We do not live under a tyranny such as the Assad government in Syria, just using that as an example. But we know that circumstances change and political currents follow their own course. And there are unintended consequences from circumstances and environments in which societies are developing. What if there was to be a tyranny here? So you think the citizenry should be unarmed and unprotected if that scenario were ever under any president to emerge in the United States? Surely that would be a scenario that you'd want the people to be able to oppose and resist, not passively say, well, at least we're protected from a mistake of a firearm being used in the wrong way in our home, even though a tyrant is in the White House. This is the contradiction and inconsistency of those, particularly on the left, who are anti-gun ownership. The presumption is, like that famous novel by Sinclair Lewis, it can never happen here. Well, it can happen here. And if it was, how would you want people to be able to defend themselves against the aggression and the tyranny and the brutality and the dictatorship of a government that you abhorred? That is the final measure of the ability of people to own guns and be able to arm themselves of various and sundry types, because the lawful authorities have very strong and powerful weaponry.
Yeah, you mentioned the revolutionaries in the American Revolutionary War. I mean, it was an attempt at gun confiscation that precipitated the revolution.
Right.
When the British forces were going to Lexington and Concord, it was with the specific mission of taking away people's guns. And there's a very simple reason for that. They know that once people are disarmed, they become very obedient.
Mm-hmm.
And the colonists understood that perfectly. And that's why they rounded up their guns and they said, you ain't taking them away. And that's what precipitated the revolution. So our ancestors understood the critical importance of keeping and bearing arms and not letting your own government confiscate those guns. Now, remember that the whole reason why Americans were so leery of the Constitution, they'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation for more than 10 years, where the powers of the federal government were so weak that the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. Imagine that, a government with no power to tax, because they understood that taxation involves the power to destroy. So when the Constitutional Convention proposes this new federal government, they're very leery of this thing. You know, they say, well, okay, there's a problem with the articles, but how do we know this government isn't going to come in and become this tyrannical government like our previous government, the British government? And the idea was, well, here's the charter, here's the Constitution, it sets forth the powers. And you can tell how suspicious people were of this and leery by the virtue of the fact that they demanded the Bill of Rights on top of that doctrine. Well, we live today under a massive welfare state, a massive warfare state, involving really agencies that they never would have approved of as being tyrannical, like the Internal Revenue Service. They never would have gone along with a government that had an Internal Revenue Service. Americans lived without income taxation for 150 years or so. There was no national security state. They had a limited government republic. If you had told Americans that the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution was going to bring into existence a Pentagon, a massive military establishment, foreign interventionism, CIA and NSA, and even an FBI, a national police force, they would have never approved the deal. It would have been the Articles of Confederation just continuously. Well, so we live under this kind of system that brings into existence things like the Pinochet regime in Chile, a military dictatorship, unelected for some, 15 years or more, brutalizing people, rounding up 50 or 60,000 people, killing 3,000 or 4,000 of them, torturing virtually all of them or raping them. This is the mindset of the national security establishment. They were supporting Pinochet during all those years. Or take, for example, today, the U.S. support of the Egyptian military dictatorship, a brutal regime. And here's the U.S. supporting them. So nobody's ever going to suggest to me that if the proper conditions weren't right here in the United States, where they concluded that national security was at stake, that they wouldn't adopt the same powers that they've brought into existence in Chile, that they support in Egypt and other tyrannical states. No one will ever convince me of that. And so, but one of the things that deters them from doing that, from making them think twice before they do it, is how well armed the American citizens would be. So that if you tried to establish, let's say, Abu Ghraib prisons across the land, there'd be plenty of husbands and fathers and women or spouses or whatever saying, you ain't going to do this to me or my children or my spouse or whatever. So that it's an insurance policy. If you look, for example, at the Swiss, that's basically their philosophy, that the government's not going to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, no foreign entanglements, no foreign interventions. But man, everybody's mobilized, ready to mobilize in the event of an invasion. Everybody's well armed. They have assault rifles in their homes. They know where to deploy in case of an emergency and invasion. And nobody dares jack with the Swiss. Even Hitler, as much as he wanted Switzerland, his advisor said, we will beat them. But in the end, our army will be decimated by these fierce, well-armed defenders who know how to use their guns. And then on the criminal side, notice that criminals always choose, or mostly choose, to go and do their killing sprees at gun-free zones. And I mean, why not? I mean, you never see a killing spree at a gun show, for example. They find targets. Well, now some of these states are realizing this, like with respect to churches. It used to be illegal, and it still is illegal in some states to take guns to churches. But recently, I forget where it happened, where this guy walks into the church and he's ready to fire his guns at everybody. Well, the law, permitted people to do concealed carry at the church, and they took this guy out immediately. I think he may have killed one or two people, but I mean, he would have killed dozens if that hadn't been the case. So it's a classic example of where gun rights protect people from the violence of others. Finally, Richard, I think it's important to point out that there is a problem with violence in America, and that's the excuse that the gun control crowd uses. But it's better to ferret out the root causes of the violence. I mean, you don't see this massive violence in Switzerland. So here you've got this massive drug war, which is a root cause of massive violence, not just here, but also in Mexico. You get rid of the drug war and violence in America would plummet, not only because you've gotten rid of the drug gangs and drug cartels instantaneously, they can't compete in the legitimate market, but also all the drug addicts and drug users that are robbing people to pay for the exorbitant black market prices of drugs. All that would go away. So here is the solution to that part of it. I think we also should not discount the role that U.S. interventionism abroad plays in violence here at home. The idea has always been that, oh, well, as long as the U.S. is just killing people over there, it will not have an effect on American society here at home. The mainstream press plays along with it. They don't show pictures of all the death and destruction that U.S. forces are wreaking in these foreign lands. I think it has adversely impacted here. I think these rash, unexplained, irrational mass killings are essentially copycat killers from people who they're a little bit off base, but something is triggered off in them. And I think it's involved with this culture of violence and death that is wreaked on people by the national security establishment overseas.
I also want to sort of deal with slightly other sort of aspect to this. I live in South Carolina. South Carolina was the ideological bedrock for the preservation of slavery before the American Civil War. All the pro-slavery firebrands, John C. Calhoun and others, came here. They had delusionary dreams of an independent South that would then conquer Central and South America and made it one large slave empire. They actually wrote those things. Now, what were the two things that the slave states imposed, particularly in a place like South Carolina? And that was, two things were prohibited. It was against the law to teach slaves reading and writing. The second one was to prohibit the holding and the use of armaments of any type of weapon in the hand of the slaves. Why the prohibition against learning to read and write? Well, a person who has read and write begins to realize that there's a wider world outside of his ignorance that says he doesn't need to be a slave and shouldn't be a slave. The slave owners were afraid of education. The second one was the whole prevention of allowing the slaves to have any form of armaments to protect themselves against the violence of the slave master or to attempt to rebel against the system. Was it wrong when slaves in the Old South, tragically never succeeding, but there were slave rebellions? And in the act of rebelling on a plantation, they seized weapons and they used them against their masters and against the surrounding posses that these slave states had to patrol areas at night to oppose them as well, so they could escape, sometimes for long periods of time, into the surrounding forests or swamps, where they could live, however uncomfortably, a period of non-control by their masters, in a sense, a degree of personal freedom through these acts of self-defense. Was this wrong? Should the slaves have said, nobody should have arms? Some have arms, but not all should have arms. Would people who are against slavery oppose the taking up of arms by private individuals of self-defense? Or would they oppose those who are not slaves coming to the armed aid of helping to protect or free slaves? These are important questions. We live in a society which, for the average person, is a society of everyday, ordinary interaction rule of law. You don't worry that your boss is going to hit you over the head and not give you your pay this week. You don't expect your neighbor is going to pick your pocket while you're both out on the line, checkout line at the supermarket. People people abide by the common decency of respect for each other's lives and properties. But merely because this creates a full sense of security in us should not take away from the fact that there are circumstances, both private criminals and potentially at some point the government under which you're living can become itself a tyrant to both limit your freedom, deny your freedom, or even deny you your right to life. And it's for these reasons that we have to allow people to have a right, as a natural right, to take up the means of self-defense, weaponry, to secure and protect their life and liberty that they already have and others are threatening, but others have denied it, which they want to reclaim.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, there's also the racist origins of gun control in the South.
Yes.
It was part of the standard Jim Crow measures that were coming into existence in the late 1800s because the bigots wanted to deny blacks the ability to defend themselves from the Ku Klux Klan or other bigots that were there burning their homes down if they dared to protest or dared to vote. Guns were the equalizer. All of a sudden, blacks had an ability to defend themselves against these people that were burning them out of their homes or killing them or whatever. And that's part of that Jim Crow mentality in the South. So, Richard, that's pretty much out of time. We need to wrap things up, but I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Again, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come to visit us at fff.org. We've got 30 years of worth of principled arguments on all aspects of liberty, including gun control and gun rights. And come and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notice of these videos. And Richard, I greatly enjoyed the conversation as always.
And I want to just, again, as I try always to remember to do so, I want to thank our viewers and listeners of sharing their time with us. And I hope they'll do it again in the near future.
Yep. We'll see y'all next week. Thank you again.